The morning sun had not fully cleared the horizon over the Ashley River when Richard Hale's black Mercedes eased up the long, curved driveway of his Charleston estate. A soft mist clung to the manicured hedges, and the air still carried that faint bite you only feel in late spring before the day turns warm. His driver had barely put the car in park before Richard stepped out, phone in hand, his voice clipped and urgent. "No delays. We close today, or I walk. Do you hear me?" He didn't wait for an answer. Ending the call with a thumb, he strode toward the front porch, the heels of his polished Oxfords clicking against the brick. Richard hadn't stayed here in weeks. Most nights, he was either in conference rooms or at hotel bars in other states, chasing deals. This house, a 3-story testament to Southern grandeur, was mostly for show, somewhere to entertain, to impress. Today was different. Today, he wanted privacy, control, and a setting that screamed success to the 2 investors flying in from New York. He opened the heavy mahogany front door and stepped into the foyer. Immediately, something felt off. Not a mess, exactly, but not the immaculate perfection he was used to. The cream throw pillows on the white sectional in the living room were slightly off-center. A single coffee mug sat on the glass coffee table, a faint ring marking its base. The hardwood floor gleamed in the morning light, but the mop streaks caught his eye, uneven, as if someone had rushed, and there was that smell, bleach, faint but sharp, the kind you notice when someone's been scrubbing in a hurry. Richard's jaw tightened. He called out, his tone already edged with irritation. "Clara!" A pause. Then, from down the hall, came the calm reply. "In here, Mr. Hale." He followed the voice into the sunroom, where Clara Johnson stood in front of the tall windows, wearing yellow gloves and holding a spray bottle in one hand, a cloth in the other. The late morning light caught the streaks she'd missed on the glass. Clara had been with the Hale family for more than 2 decades, hired back when Madison and Brooke were still wearing braces, and Elaine was still in the picture. Reliable, quiet, efficient. She'd never been a problem. Until now, apparently. "You were supposed to be done by 6, Richard said flatly. "Almost done," she answered, not flustered in the least. "One of the little ones must have had sticky hands on the glass. Peanut butter, maybe." "That's not the point." He gestured toward the living room as he walked out. "What is this? My guests will be here in less than an hour, and the place looks like a bed and breakfast on its worst day. Did you even finish vacuuming?" "I vacuumed last night, sir, and I was going to—" "Clearly not well enough," he cut in, his voice rising. "This is unacceptable, Clara. I don't care how long you've been here." By now, Paige Turner, his executive assistant, had appeared in the hallway holding a leather folder. Just behind her, 2 sharply dressed men stepped inside, their polished shoes tapping softly against the floor. They paused, exchanging quick glances, clearly catching more than they were supposed to. Richard barely noticed. "Do you know how many zeros are on the line today? This isn't about streaks or pillows. It's about showing people we're serious. My name deserves better." He didn't expect her to talk back. For a moment, she didn't. She pulled off her gloves, one at a time, dropped them into her cleaning caddy, then turned toward him. There was no anger in her face, just calm and something heavier, like she was measuring her words. "Mr. Hale," Clara said quietly, but not weakly, "if my work was good enough to raise your children, it should be good enough to keep your house clean." The sentence landed in the room like a brick through glass. Nobody spoke. Paige's eyes flicked to the investors, who now stood very still, caught between discomfort and curiosity. Richard's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The silence stretched. Clara didn't move. Her posture was straight, her gaze steady. 20-plus years of birthdays, holidays, school pickups, and midnight fevers were wrapped up in that one sentence. Paige glanced down at the folder in her hands. The investors shifted their weight, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Richard felt the heat rise in his face. Not rage, though it could have passed for it, but something closer to shame. He wasn't ready to name it, especially not here, not now. Paige stepped forward, her voice careful. "Mr. Hale, we should set up in the study." He waved her off without looking at her. "In a minute." One of the investors cleared his throat, murmuring something about waiting outside. They left without another word, stepping onto the back patio. The click of the door closing behind them was louder than it should have been. Clara bent down, lifted her caddy, and walked past him toward the hallway. As she passed, she said, just low enough for only him to hear, "I don't expect thanks, Mr. Hale, but I do expect decency. I raised girls in this house who knew how to say good morning. You might want to try it." Her footsteps faded down the hardwood hall. Richard stood still for a long moment, staring at nothing, trying to decide if he was more embarrassed by her words or the fact that she was right. Somewhere behind him, the grandfather clock in the foyer chimed the quarter hour. He straightened his tie, turned toward the study, and forced himself into the role he knew best, the man in charge, the deal-maker, the one who never lost face. But for the first time in years, the house felt less like a fortress and more like a mirror, and Richard wasn't sure he liked what it showed. Paige kept her eyes on the leather folder because it was easier than looking at anyone's face. Paper was neutral. Paper didn't hold grudges or look embarrassed. The air in the foyer had that stillness you get after a summer storm, charged, quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. Clara's yellow gloves sat in the top of her cleaning caddy like two bright flags, and the faint smell of bleach drifted behind her down the hall. The investors had slipped out to the patio and were pretending to enjoy the river view, which was the second best place to be. The best place to be, Paige figured, was anywhere except this room. "Study," Richard said finally, as if forcing the word through a throat that had gone dry. Paige nodded and moved ahead of him, letting her heels announce her purpose on the hardwood. The study was all dark wood and old Charleston money, floor-to-ceiling shelves, a marble fireplace that had never seen a real fire, oil paintings of marshes in gold frames. She set the folder on the long table and began laying out the printouts, cash flow models, lender commitments, a one-sheet summary with bullet points Richard had rehearsed on the flight back. It all looked so sure of itself on paper. He came in a beat later and didn't sit right away. He stood at the window with his back to her, arms folded, watching the river push gently past the lawn as if it had somewhere important to be. Paige waited, counting her breaths. She'd learned to leave space for silence around him. People like Richard needed the illusion that they were deciding when the conversation started, even when it had already started without them. "I don't want this to become a thing," he said finally. "Understood," she said, even though the thing had already arrived, unpacked, and was setting its luggage down. He pulled out a chair and sat. His tie was still perfect, but his face wasn't. The color had drained a little, leaving him looking older than he liked to look. Paige slid him the executive summary and clicked a pen she didn't need to use. "Investors will be ready in 5, she said. "Robert likes to open with cap table questions. Thomas will ask about the municipal approvals in the second phase." He nodded. "We'll keep them inside. No more patio." "Of course." He didn't look up. "The place doesn't look like a... what did I say?" "Bed and breakfast on its worst day," Paige offered gently. He closed his eyes and winced. "Right." Paige had seen him rip through vendors for less. She'd watched him dismiss a project manager for mixing up meeting rooms. She'd never seen him hit a wall like this. No target to push, nobody to crush into compliance, just himself, and that was a fight you couldn't bill to the client. "Paige," he said, voice low, "you ever feel like people take advantage?" She considered. It was an odd question from a man whose calendar was a map of other people's concessions. "Sometimes," she said, keeping it neutral. "I don't pay her to raise my children," he said. That wasn't in the job description. He wasn't asking. He was defending the version of himself that didn't know how to be wrong. Paige's instinct was to soften the moment, to give him an exit ramp he could take without losing face. But out on the patio, 2 investors were deciding what kind of man they were about to trust with a pile of their money. There are numbers, Paige knew, and then there's the story people tell themselves about the numbers. The story had changed the second Clara took off those gloves. "She's been here a long time," Paige said. "Longer than me. Longer than most of your VPs." He rubbed the bridge of his nose with his thumb, a gesture she recognized from all-nighters on the road. "I didn't sleep," he said, though she hadn't asked. "I was in Charlotte half the week. This Colorado thing, if it slips, we're exposed. The press hears we missed another closing and—" He stopped himself, jaw tight. "I can't afford noise." Paige slid the project timeline toward him. He didn't look at it. He was staring past her, into a part of the room that wasn't there. "When the twins were 10, he said slowly, surprising her, "I missed a recital. Madison's, I think. Elaine called me 3 times. I was in Houston. Oil people. Big deal." He gave a humorless laugh. "I sent flowers, big ones, the kind that announce themselves when they arrive." Paige waited. "Clara kept the program," he said. "She taped it inside the pantry cabinet. I saw it on a Sunday when I came home early and the house was quiet. She writes notes on things, groceries, birthdays, reminders. I haven't thought about that in years." Paige pictured the pantry. Top shelf perfectly lined with labeled jars, because that was the way Clara liked it. She could see the taped program, too. She could imagine Clara's neat handwriting, the kind that comes from writing down other people's needs, so often you're good at it. "She cared," Paige said. "Still does." A knock at the door saved him from answering. One of the investors leaned in. "We'll give you 2 more minutes," he said, affable in a way that let you know he was keeping score. "Thank you," Paige said, and closed the door. She turned back to Richard. This was the moment she usually filled with calendar notes and numbers. Instead, she let the quiet sit 1 second longer. "Let's get through this," he said. "Then we'll—" He waved a hand, as if he could wave the morning back into order. They did get through it. The pitch itself was clean. Paige made sure of that. The deck clicked along, the forward-looking statements landed where they were supposed to, and the capital stack stood up when they pushed on it. But there was a draft in the room that had nothing to do with air conditioning. Robert's questions were polite to the point of chilly. Thomas kept glancing at Richard like he was listening for something other than answers. When it was over, everyone smiled the way people do when they've agreed to keep thinking. They promised to circle back by week's end. Paige had learned that circle back is a phrase that means everything and nothing, depending on how much you need it to mean everything. The front door closed behind them with the soft thud of money moving further away. Paige gathered the decks and closed her laptop. Richard didn't move. He was watching the door like it might swing back open and change the last hour of his life. "They said they'll circle back by the end of the week," she offered. "That's code for they weren't impressed," he said, not quite asking. He sank into the armchair by the fireplace, the way men do when the posture gives out before the person does. Paige held the silence another beat, then decided to spend the truth. "They weren't impressed," she said evenly. "Not with the numbers, with the room." He didn't flinch. "The room." "You," she said, "the way the morning started." He stared at the painting above the mantel, something with marsh grass and egret wings frozen mid-flight. "I didn't hire her to raise my kids," he said again, as if repetition could make it more defensible. "Neither was saving Madison's prom dress at midnight when someone spilled red punch," Paige said softly, "or driving Brooke to the ER when the school nurse couldn't reach anyone, or the essays. There were essays, right? College. Somebody helped workshop those." His eyes flicked to her. It was the look of a man who'd been caught between 2 versions of the past and didn't know which one to believe. "Did she tell you that?" he asked. "No," Paige said. "The girls did, in bits and pieces, over the years." He looked down at his hands, the way people do when they realize the tools they've always used won't help with the thing that's in front of them now. "I don't know what came over me," he said, but it came out thin. "You do," Paige said, kind but with edges. "You were stressed. You needed someone to blame." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh in another room. He didn't say anything for a while. The clock in the hallway ticked. A boat engine hummed somewhere beyond the lawn. Paige could see the river through the window behind him, a wide, steady ribbon headed where it always goes, with or without the men who shout near it. "She looked at me like she knows me better than I know myself," he said. "Maybe she does." He glanced at her, searching for the angle, the trick, the strategy that would turn this into a solvable problem. Paige set the folder down and rested a hand on it, as if to keep all the tidy numbers from sliding onto the floor. "You're not a monster, Richard," she said. It felt strange to use his first name in this room, but necessary. But sometimes when people get used to being in control, they stop noticing the hands that help hold things up. He held her eyes for a second. "You're saying I forgot she's human. I'm saying you forgot she's more than just a name on your payroll." The sentence landed. He looked away first. When Paige left him, he was still in the chair, the painting of the marsh framed perfectly above his head like a sentence passed by a quiet judge. She gathered the coffee cups from the meeting herself and walked them to the kitchen. It wasn't her job, but neither was any of this. On the way, she passed the family room where the photographs lined the built-in shelves. She'd seen them before, but now she stopped. The twins in cap and gown, all teeth and nerves, a birthday party with a lopsided cake, a Christmas morning from years ago, the girls still in matching pajamas, the wrapping paper a colorful tide around their feet. In the edges of more than one frame, there was Clara. Not centered, not posed, present. Paige found the pantry and opened the door. The inside face of it was a patchwork of taped-up notes, Madison's first dance recital program, a dentist's appointment card from 2011, a grocery list in neat block letters that read like a diary of other people's preferences. Brooke, almond milk, no vanilla. Madison, green apples. Dad, no decaf. At the top, slightly yellowed with age, a small piece of paper that simply said "Good morning" in Clara's hand, underlined twice, like instruction and blessing. Paige stood there longer than she meant to. She thought about her own apartment, white walls, 2 plants that survived because she'd learned to set reminders, a fridge that held more takeout containers than plans. She wasn't jealous of the money in this house. She'd never felt that tug. But this quiet record of care, made her throat feel tight for reasons she didn't have time to unpack. She took a picture, then put her phone away as if she'd taken something she had to promise not to misuse. She returned to the study. Richard hadn't moved much. The set of his shoulders had changed, though. Less armor, more weight. "You should talk to her," Paige said, keeping it simple. He nodded, like a man agreeing with the weather. "Later," he said, after they circle back. "That's not when it matters most," she said, but she didn't press. People only hear certain truths when they can stand them. She left him again, this time for longer. There were emails to send, model tabs to clean up, a follow-up packet to draft that would hit Robert's inbox before he was wheels up. Paige did those things because she was good at them, and because doing things is how you avoid thinking too hard about the things you can't fix. When she looked up, the house had shifted. Not louder, just different. The kind of different you feel when someone has moved from one room to another and the air remembers them. Richard had drifted down the hall without registering the steps it took to get there. The family room looked exactly like it always did. Cream rug, low table, sofa that was supposed to be sat on but never really was. He stood in front of the shelf of frames and let his eyes pass over his life in pictures. There he was with a governor at a charity gala, grinning in a tux that still fit. There were the girls, younger and then older still, the way kids do when you're not looking, which is most of the time you think you are. And there, half cut off by the edge of the glass, was Clara, holding a tissue at the back of a high school gym, her smile so big it made the picture tilt. He remembered the smell of cookies in the weeks before exams. He remembered the way the kitchen lights glowed warm on December evenings when he came home late, like someone had turned the house on so he wouldn't walk into a museum. He remembered a Thanksgiving when a client had thrown a tantrum on the phone and he'd taken the call on the back steps. When he walked back inside, there was a second plate waiting on the counter labeled "Eat while it's hot, sir," handwriting familiar as sunrise. He'd eaten it standing up with his jacket still on. He'd never said thank you because the call had gone long and the pie had cooled and there had always been another email to send. He found himself back in the study again, because the study was where he went when he didn't know what to do. The desk was covered in neat stacks. Page's work. The investors' business cards, face down. He picked one up and looked at the embossed letters like they might spell an answer if he stared long enough. Out on the patio, a pair of wrens pecked at something invisible in the joints between the flagstones. The river was full of routine. Fishermen in the distance, a dull green john boat sliding along the opposite bank, the hum of an outboard motor, the lazy drawl of a day that had no idea what people were doing in houses next to it. He thought about calling Elaine. The impulse was ridiculous and immediate, bone memory of old roles. He let it pass. Elaine would have an opinion delivered in a tone that sounded like concern and landed like a footnote. He wasn't in the market for judgment disguised as help. Besides, this wasn't hers to solve. He checked his phone. 2 emails from Robert's analyst, a "nice to meet you" from Thomas's associate, a text from Madison he hadn't answered yet, photo of a new apartment she and Brooke were considering, exposed brick and big windows, and a plant in the corner that would never survive. Beneath it, a caption. "What do you think, Dad?" He typed, deleted, typed again, settled on, "Looks good. Proud of you." He stared at the bubble as if pride could travel by LTE and fix what it hadn't been around to build. He put the phone face down and stood. The chair creaked in a way it hadn't when he bought it. He felt absurdly like apologizing to furniture for not being the kind of man who knew how to use a house right. He walked to the window and pressed his palm lightly to the cool glass. He could see his reflection faintly, a tall man in a perfect suit who had somehow made himself small. He pictured Clara's face in the sunroom, not angry, not afraid, not even pleading, just steady, the way you'd look at weather coming in. He had yelled at people who yelled back. He could outshout just about anyone. He didn't know what to do with quiet that didn't need his permission to exist. He thought about the pantry door. He hadn't seen it this morning, but he could see it in his head. Scraps of paper making a private archive. Who builds a life in the margins like that? Someone who knows the center is already reserved. Page tapped once and stepped in. "Caterers delayed per your earlier request," she said. "If you still want—" "No," he said. "Let them come on time. We'll eat what we ordered." She nodded. "I'll be in the office for an hour. I'll ping you when Robert replies." He almost told her not to bother, that he already knew what circle back sounded like when it turned into pass, but he kept the thought where it belonged. "Thank you," he said instead. She hesitated at the doorway, reading the room again the way good assistants learn to. Then she said, measured but clear, "You should talk to her before this turns into something you remember for the wrong reasons." He opened his mouth to tell her he would. He closed it because he wasn't sure. When he was alone again, he sat and let the afternoon light move across the floor toward him. Time is a thing you can spend without noticing, he realized. And then one day you look around and wonder who cashed it in on your behalf. He had cashed plenty. He had framed the receipts and hung them on these walls. He had a house whose windows reflected an impressive version of a man he sometimes recognized. The phone buzzed. Robert's name. A short, polite email about market conditions and internal timelines and appreciation for the conversation. He skimmed the middle and read the beginning and end twice. He set the phone down and didn't curse. The old him would have called someone and demanded a reason. The new him, if there was one, sat there and thought about a woman walking down a hallway with a caddy and 2 yellow gloves and the kind of dignity you can't buy in bulk. By the time the sun slid west enough to paint the river gold, the house had softened into evening. He didn't turn on many lights. The dim felt honest. He walked the hallway once, twice, stopping in front of the photographs and then moving past them like a man practicing leaving a room well. He ended up in the study again because the study was a habit. He pulled a legal pad from the drawer and wrote a list because lists were what he knew how to do. Call Robert, call Thomas, follow up City Council Doc. The pen hovered. He wrote, "Smaller Clara." He stared at the name as if it were an address he wasn't sure how to get to without getting lost. He thought about the first time she'd walked in here, navy blue uniform, small notebook tucked into the apron pocket. Elaine had hired her. He remembered that because he'd complained about the rate, and Elaine had said, "This isn't about money, Richard. It's about time." He'd made a joke about how in his world those were the same thing. He'd thought it was funny. It was, in the way that things are funny before they stop being funny. He pushed the pad away. "Good morning," he heard in his head, in Clara's handwriting, underlined twice. He hadn't said those words to her in a long time. He was a quick update and what's the status person. He was a man who learned to cut greetings out of emails to save time and then started cutting them out of rooms. The river kept moving. The clock in the hallway kept time. Somewhere, a car door closed and a neighbor laughed, and the day went on doing what days do. He felt the room like a weight and a mercy at once. He didn't notice when Paige reappeared to drop a file on the edge of the desk. He didn't see her linger, reading his face like a forecast. He only registered the quiet after she left, a quiet that felt less like emptiness and more like an invitation he hadn't earned yet. He didn't know what he would say to Clara when the chance came. He only knew he needed the chance to come from something other than convenience or the need to make a deal feel salvageable. He needed it to come from the part of himself he'd starved by feeding all the other parts. He sat alone in the study, looking out at the river, wondering if he'd lost something more important than money. The first morning without Clara, Richard stood in the kitchen with a French press, watching coffee grounds swirl in the hot water. The smell was fine, the color looked right, but the first sip made him grimace. Too bitter, maybe too strong. He poured the rest into the sink and let it run down the drain, thinking how strange it was to miss a taste you'd never really noticed before. He'd asked Paige to hold all meetings at the office that week. It felt easier than explaining why he didn't want anyone in the house. The truth was, the house felt different, emptier in a way he didn't like to admit. It was still clean. Paige had arranged for a service to come twice. The counters shone, the floors smelled faintly of lemon polish. But it wasn't Clara's clean. It was the kind of clean you get in hotel rooms. Tidy, scentless, a little cold. He tried to keep his routines. Morning emails, midday calls, evening walks through the study, while talking to clients in other time zones. But even the air felt wrong. Quiet without the faint hum of a vacuum somewhere, without the rhythmic squeak of a mop on hardwood. By the third day, he found himself opening the pantry door without knowing why. He didn't see Clara's notes taped inside. Paige must have had them removed during the last deep clean, but he could picture them clearly. Grocery lists in neat handwriting, reminders for things he hadn't thought about in years. A part of him wished he'd taken a photo. Friday afternoon, Paige stepped into his office with an envelope in her hand. "Your calendar's open tonight?" she said. "Thought you should know Clara's granddaughter's recital is at St. Michael's. 7 o'clock. He frowned. "Why are you telling me?" "Because you're going," she said, in that even tone she used when she was already walking toward the door. At 7 sharp, Richard parked 2 blocks from the old white church with the tall steeple and worn brick steps. The air smelled faintly of magnolia from the trees lining Meeting Street. He walked in quietly, keeping to the back pew. The space was warm and bright, full of parents shifting in their seats and kids fidgeting with violin bows and sheet music. He saw her immediately, Clara, in a dark blue dress, hair neatly pinned, sitting near the front with a small program folded in her lap. The pride in her smile was unmistakable. When her granddaughter walked out, holding a violin almost as long as her arm, Clara sat a little taller, eyes locked on the girl, like nothing else in the room mattered. The music wasn't perfect. High notes wavered, a bow squeaked against the strings. But Clara's smile never faltered. Richard stayed just long enough to hear the end of Amazing Grace, the applause filling the room like a warm tide. Then he slipped out before anyone noticed him, walking back into the humid Charleston night. He didn't tell anyone he'd been there. Not Paige, not the twins, and certainly not Clara. The weekend passed slowly. He made coffee again on Sunday morning and managed to get the proportions right this time, though it still didn't taste like Clara's. He vacuumed the living room, but halfway through he stopped and looked at the crooked pillows on the sofa. Normally, he'd straighten them without thinking. This time, he left them as they were. By Monday, the rhythm of the house had settled into something he didn't recognize. It was quieter, yes, but also lighter in a way that made him uneasy, like it didn't need him. He worked from the study with the back doors open, letting the river breeze in, and caught himself glancing toward the hallway every so often. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Maybe the sound of footsteps, or the clink of a coffee mug on the kitchen counter. Maybe a calm voice saying his name without fear or hurry. When the phone rang, it startled him. It was Paige. "Robert's asking about the follow-up deck," she said. "I'll get to it this afternoon." There was a pause. "You're thinking about calling her, aren't you?" He didn't answer. She didn't press. After they hung up, he walked into the living room and stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the sofa. The pillows were still crooked. He left them that way and went back to work. It was late morning when Richard heard the front door open. No knock, no doorbell, just the sound of hinges he hadn't realized he knew that well. He stepped out from the study, half expecting Paige, but the sight stopped him cold. Clara stood in the foyer, wearing her navy blue uniform like she'd never left. Her cleaning caddy rested at her feet, yellow gloves draped over the side. She didn't look rushed or hesitant. She looked like someone who'd decided exactly how this day was going to go. "You came back," he said, and his voice betrayed more relief than he meant it to. "I didn't come back for you," she replied evenly. "I came back for me." He nodded once, letting the words land. Fair. She stepped further into the house, setting her bag down by the console table. "Before I touch a thing in this place, there are conditions." He leaned against the doorframe. "I'm listening. No yelling, no snapping your fingers, no acting like I don't exist until you need something. You want a clean house? I'll do that, but I'm not your shadow." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "You never were. I just treated you like one." She tilted her head, studying him like she was checking for sincerity. "I saw you at the recital," he said quietly. "You didn't say anything." "Wasn't my moment." Her eyes softened just enough to register the comment before she walked past him toward the kitchen. He followed, keeping a respectful distance. She glanced at the counters, the trash bin, the way the sunlight hit the floor. "It's been kept up," she said, "but it's missing something." "What's that?" "Care," she answered without looking at him. He stayed quiet. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment, "about the house, the girls, Elaine, you, everything." "That's new," she said, her tone neither mocking nor impressed. He went to the counter and picked up a white envelope. "I've been working with a board on a small initiative for people who've carried others for too long without anyone ever carrying them back." She opened the envelope slowly, scanning the letter inside, a grant offer, full funding for her to start her own cleaning business if she wanted. "You did this?" "I just signed the check. The idea came from watching someone work harder than anyone I know and never ask for credit." She folded the letter and slipped it back in the envelope. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No, I'm asking you to have options." Silence stretched between them. Finally, she said, "I don't need flowers or a plaque. I just need to be treated like a person." "You are." "I wasn't this morning?" "That morning," he corrected. "I'll do better." She paused at the base of the stairs, then turned back. "I don't know if I'll stay, Richard." It was the first time she'd used his first name in years. It landed heavier than anything else she'd said. He nodded slowly. "I'd understand if you didn't. But if I do," she continued, "this house is going to look different." "How?" "It's time someone stopped treating it like a showroom and started treating it like a home again." She walked upstairs without waiting for his response, leaving him in the kitchen with the envelope still on the counter. For the first time, he didn't see her as someone who just worked here. He saw her as the one person who'd kept the fabric of his family from unraveling completely, and maybe the only one who still could. The next morning, Richard woke before his alarm and lay there listening for sounds he hadn't noticed in years. Not traffic, not the river, house sounds, pipes settling, the faint tick of the thermostat kicking on. Somewhere, a small clink, like a mug being set on stone. He showered, dressed without a tie, and hesitated at the threshold of his own kitchen as if it belonged to someone else. Clara stood by the sink with the window cracked, letting cool air slide over the sill. She wore the Navy uniform, yes, but her posture said guest on her own terms. "Good morning," he said, and it came out softer than he expected. She looked up and nodded. "Morning." He waited for correction. He half expected her to measure the greeting against the years he hadn't said it, but she just turned back to the sink and ran water over a handful of berries. The smell of coffee was in the room, not the sharp bitterness of his French press experiment, but a rounder, steadier aroma. He moved toward the pot, then stopped. "May I?" "You may," she said, and it was the closest thing to a smile he'd seen on her face in weeks. He poured for both of them without asking and set her cup near her right hand, because that was where she always reached. He hadn't realized he knew that either. "I adjusted your grounds," she said, glancing at the bag on the counter. "You were making it strong enough to take the paint off the walls." "I noticed." "Thought so." He took a sip. The heat surprised him, then the taste, clear, not bitter. He leaned against the island. "I meant what I said yesterday," he offered. "About doing better. I heard you." She rinsed the berries and laid them out on a dish towel, one row at a time. "Doing is the part I'm watching." He nodded, and for once he didn't defend himself. He watched too. Her hands, the rhythm of her work. There was nothing dramatic in the way she moved. The drama was in realizing how much of the house's ease came from motions he'd never seen. Paige arrived at 9 with a stack of folders and a face that had learned to keep secrets. She stepped into the kitchen and paused when she saw the two of them standing there with matching mugs like a photograph you couldn't explain. "Morning," she said brightly. "Clara." "Paige," Clara said, with warmth that seemed to surprise them both. "Deck revisions are on the table," Paige told Richard. "City council packet needs signatures by 3. Robert wants a call at noon, or he wants to let the dust settle, which is investor for we found a safer boat." "Call at noon," Richard said. "No safer boats today." Paige gave him a quick, assessing look, then set a manila envelope on the counter and tapped it once. "Also, permits for the storage closet off the mudroom. If you plan to keep the new mop and supplies, you'll need—" "I'll handle that," Clara interjected gently. "Already made a list." Paige's mouth curved. "Of course you did." The morning stretched the way good mornings do. Unhurried, full of small, useful tasks. Richard signed things without rushing, took the noon call without bulldozing, and caught himself more than once listening instead of loading the next argument. When the call ended with a non-committal, "We'll revisit next quarter," he didn't slam the phone or look for a throat to clear his frustration into. He stepped out onto the back porch and let the air sit on his face like a hand. The river moved regardless. Somewhere a boat idled, patient. When he came back in, Clara was in the family room, standing in front of the built-in shelves with a dust cloth and a small box at her feet. The frames were off the shelf, arranged on the rug by size, then by year. Then he realized with a start by who was centered and who wasn't. "Rearranging?" he asked. "Retelling," she said. "These go up front now." She held up a photo of the twins at 13, braces and all. caught mid-laugh on the back steps. He took it and found himself smiling without thinking. "And these," she said, indicating the gala shots and ribbon cuttings, "can take a little stroll to the end." "Punishing the tuxes," he said lightly. "Just making room," she replied. "Homes forget what they're for if you let the wrong pictures do all the talking." He crouched and picked through the stack. Near the bottom, a glossy shot of the kitchen at Christmas. Lights warm, cookies cooling on wire racks, a mess he'd once found irritating, and now found, to his surprise, comforting. At the edge of the frame, there she was again, not centered, carrying a tray like a stagehand whose name didn't make the program. He set that one on top of the pile that would go in the middle. Paige drifted through with a stapler and a list. 15 minutes until the permits courier arrives, she said. Also, the caterers want to know if you still prefer mini crab cakes for Thursday's reception. Richard looked at Clara. "Pimento cheese," she said, as if she were calling a play. "It's Charleston. Act like it." "Pimento cheese," he repeated. Then to Paige, "Please." Paige clicked her pen. "Look at us embracing regional authenticity," she said, and left them to their museum of frames. By early afternoon, the light had moved across the floor and the house had that slightly drowsy feel that comes after lunch, even for houses that don't eat. Richard took a late call in the study and found himself saying, "I was wrong," about a timeline he'd pushed too hard last month. The words didn't kill him. They didn't even leave a mark. When he hung up, he felt more steady than empty. Clara appeared at the doorway, not hovering, just present. "Courier's gone," she said. "I put the permits in the drawer by the phone, where you never look." "I'll start," he said, gesturing to a stack of forms. "You'll delegate," she corrected, "and you'll stop acting like a man who needs to wrestle paper to prove he's working." He almost bristled, old reflex, and then didn't. "Fair." "Also," she continued, "we're going to stop saving takeout menus in this drawer like it's a scrapbook of bad decisions." He laughed. It surprised both of them enough that they glanced at each other as if a third person had entered the room. "Something else," he said. "About yesterday." He nodded toward the kitchen, where the white envelope still sat tucked under a notepad. "I meant that. The grant. No strings." "I know what no strings sounds like, and what it looks like," she said. "And I know how it feels when the string is just thin and clear. I'll read it again tonight." "Take your time." "I will." She looked down the hall, then back at him. "Doesn't mean I'm gone tomorrow. Means I get to decide when I go and how." "As you should." They worked in companionable silence for another hour. At 3:30, Paige reappeared with a question about the Thursday guest list, and before leaving, set a small, folded note on the corner of the desk. He opened it after she left. It was one line in Paula's tidy script. "You're doing better." He placed it in the drawer with the permits, as if that were the kind of document that also deserved safekeeping. Late afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was the twins, Madison first, Brooke right after, arriving earlier than expected from a weekend checking out apartments. Their arrival was a ritual from years ago. Let yourselves in, call anyone home, go straight to the kitchen. They did just that, and then both stopped when they saw Clara. "Clara!" Madison beamed, dropping her tote and crossing the room in 3 long steps. "You look good." "You look tired," Clara said, eyes kind. "Which one of you tried to drive straight through with an empty tank again?" Brooke lifted a hand. "Wasn't empty. It was aspirational." Clara shook her head, the smile warming the room. "Sit. Tell me about the place with the brick and the windows too big to clean." Richard stood back and watched his daughters fold into conversation with a woman who had never needed to be introduced to them. He felt the sting of a feeling he didn't have a name for when he was younger, and a gentler name for now. Envy, maybe, at being left out of an ease he'd contracted for but never earned. He poured water into glasses and set them within reach, because it was a thing he could do. "Dad," Madison said after a while, "you okay? You look good." "Pimento cheese," he said, for no reason that made sense. And they laughed, which did. Brooke shifted her gaze to Clara's caddy. "You're back?" Clara's chin tipped up, not defiant, just firm. "I'm here," she said, "and I'm choosing the rest one day at a time." "Good," Brooke said. "We were going to stage a protest, maybe hold a sit-in in the pantry." She looked at Richard. "You okay with living with your feelings for a minute, Dad?" "Trying it on," he said. "Feels like linen. Wrinkles easy, wears nice." Clara pursed her lips to hide a laugh. Paige wandered in at the tail end of the line and shook her head. "This is the weirdest meeting I've had all week," she said. And somehow it felt like a benediction. The girls stayed for an hour, long enough to show photos of 2 narrow stairs and miraculous closet space you had to squint to see. Before they left, Madison stepped close to Richard and laid a hand on his arm. "You don't have to fix everything," she said. "Sometimes just being here is a fix." After they were gone, the house exhaled. Dusk softened the edges of furniture. Lamps made pockets of warmth in corners. Richard stood in the living room with Clara, both of them looking at the sofa like it had said something rude. The pillows were exactly as they'd been this morning. Crooked, a little sad, as if arranged by a teenager who had somewhere else to be. "I left them," he admitted, "on purpose. I wanted to see if it bothered me. And it did. Then it didn't. Then it did again." She nodded, approving of the honesty, if not the experiment. "They're a symbol." "Of what? Standards?" "Of who's in charge of what matters," she said. "Straightening a pillow isn't about pillows. It's about deciding if a house is for looking at or living in." He thought about the photo arrangement she'd made, about the grant letter, about saying good morning like it meant something. "Both," he said, "looking and living. Then we'll set them like people sit here," she said, "not like a magazine visits." They adjusted one cushion at a time. She nudged an angle. He stepped back to see how the whole looked. She adjusted again. Between each small move, he looked at her face to see if he could read satisfaction, the way he once read a shifting market. She didn't give him that. She gave him small nods, and those felt better. When they finished, the sofa looked invitational, like it expected stories, not just visitors. He sat, and the cushion gave the right amount, and the scene in front of him, the lamps, the frames, the slow river beyond the glass, felt earned. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll deal with the pantry." He cleared his throat. "About that. I didn't see the notes, the ones you taped up." She paused. "I took them down when I left. Would you—" He stopped. "If you stay, would you put them back, or new ones, or none? Your choice." She considered him, then looked past him at the shelf of pictures, at the room she'd arranged to tell a truer story. "We'll see," she said. "Notes are for people who read." "I'm learning." "I noticed." She lifted the empty coffee mug he'd forgotten on the table and carried it toward the kitchen. He followed with the second mug, because he could. At the sink he washed while she dried, a practical choreography that felt like something you could build a truce on. When they were done, he turned off the lamp over the sink, and without agreeing to it, they both walked back to the living room to look at what they'd made. Clara glanced at the sofa, then at him, then back at the sofa. The corner cushion on the left slouched like a tired shoulder. She clicked her tongue. "First thing we fix is those pillow placements in the living room," she said. "They still look like a teenager arranged them." 3 weeks passed before Clara returned on a Monday morning like nothing had happened. The days in between had been a quiet kind of education for Richard. Without her, the house stayed neat in a surface way, but the life was gone from it. He'd learned, reluctantly, how to work the washer, how to cook a simple breakfast, how to mop without leaving streaks. Each small task made him aware of just how much had been done for him all those years without so much as a thank you. On the first Friday of her absence, Richard had found himself standing in the grocery store aisle staring at 3 brands of coffee filters. The decision shouldn't have been difficult, but he realized he had no idea which ones she used. He ended up buying all 3 and tossing the extras in the pantry, where they sat untouched, a quiet monument to his dependence. He saw Paige less often during that stretch, but when she did come by, she never mentioned Clara. Once, while sorting mail in the kitchen, she said, "House feels bigger without her." Or emptier, Richard replied, surprising himself. When Clara finally walked back in that Monday morning, she didn't announce it. She just set her caddy down and started moving through the kitchen, pulling open drawers and straightening what had been straightened a dozen times already. Richard was in the study, but heard the faint click of the cabinet doors and the rustle of paper towels being torn from the roll. He stayed put at first, letting her have the space. Only after 10 minutes did he step into the kitchen, coffee mug in hand. "You came back," he said. "For now," she answered, eyes still on the counter she was wiping. The rhythm of the house changed instantly. The smell of lemon cleaner replaced the stale scent of the weekend. The sound of her moving, a quiet efficiency he'd once ignored, now made the place feel solid again. Over the next few days, Richard found himself lingering in rooms where she was working. Not to check on her, not to give instructions, just to be there. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not. One afternoon, as she dusted the bookshelves in the study, he asked, "Do you ever think about doing something else?" "I've been doing something else," she said without looking at him. "Raising a family that wasn't mine. Building a life that didn't have my name on the deed." The words sat between them until he finally said, "I meant for yourself." "That's new," she replied, and he couldn't tell if there was humor in it. He started showing up in the kitchen in the mornings before she left, offering her coffee from the French press. She accepted once, declined the next day, but the offer became routine. On Thursday, she asked him how the grocery store trip had gone. "I bought 3 kinds of filters," he admitted. "That sounds about right," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. The change wasn't loud or sudden, but it was steady. He stopped giving orders and started asking questions. She stopped answering with the bare minimum. They talked about small things, the weather, the river, the best place in town for biscuits. By the end of the 3rd week, the house didn't just feel clean again, it felt lived in, and Richard realized that was the difference Clara had been making all along. It was the first Saturday in months that Richard didn't have a meeting or a call scheduled. The river air drifted in through the open kitchen window, carrying the smell of salt and marsh. Clara was already there, rinsing a bowl of strawberries. "Morning," he said. She looked up. "Morning, coffee's ready." He poured them both a cup and set hers where he knew she liked it. They sat at the island, the quiet between them no longer awkward, just comfortable. "I've been thinking," he said after a while, "about what you said the day I yelled at you." "That was a day," she replied, her tone even but not unkind. "You were right. If your work was good enough to raise my kids, it should have been good enough to keep my house clean." She met his eyes, searching for the catch. And I'm sorry, not just for that morning, for the years before it, too." Clara didn't answer right away. She sipped her coffee, then set the mug down carefully. "I've heard a lot of apologies in my life. Some were just words people use to end a conversation. I think you mean yours." "I do," she nodded. "Then we'll see if your actions match it." They went about the day in an easy rhythm. He helped her carry supplies upstairs. She asked his opinion on where to hang a picture in the hallway. A small thing, but it felt like an invitation. In the afternoon, they worked side by side in the garden, pulling weeds and trimming hedges. At one point, Richard straightened up and looked at the house. "You know," he said, "I used to think of this place as an asset, an investment. But it's just a building without the people who care for it." Clara brushed dirt from her gloves. "A lot of folks don't realize that until it's almost too late." He glanced at her. "I was almost too late, wasn't I?" She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. Almost. By early evening, the house had that rare glow it got after a full day of work and fresh air. Clara packed up her caddy, but before she left, she stopped in the living room. The sofa pillows were crooked again. Richard caught her looking at them and grinned. "I was going to fix those." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to see if you'd notice." He adjusted them until she gave a small nod of approval. At the door, she turned to him. "I'm not promising forever, Richard. I'm promising today. And maybe tomorrow if you keep acting right." "That's fair," he said. She stepped outside into the warm Charleston dusk, leaving the faint scent of lemon cleaner and coffee behind her. Richard stood there for a moment, watching her go, and realized the house didn't feel like a showroom anymore. It felt like a home because he'd finally started seeing the person who'd been making it one all along. Some lessons, he thought, take a lifetime to learn, and the best ones often come from people you underestimated. Some stories don't leave with the last page. They linger, like the scent of rain on an old porch or the faint hum of a song you didn't know you remembered. Watching Richard and Clara's quiet reckoning unfold was like watching a storm clear. No flash, no applause, just the slow return of sunlight over a place that had forgotten what warmth felt like. In the end, it wasn't the raised voice that changed anything. It was the steady one. Clara didn't win her dignity back with noise. She never lost it to begin with. She stood in the truth of her years, the unshakable worth of her work, and the history she carried in her hands. And in doing so, she reminded him, and maybe all of us, that real respect isn't bought with wealth or titles, but earned in the quiet ways we show up for each other. For the Black community, this story holds a mirror. It speaks to the countless times value has gone unseen, effort has gone unnamed, and yet grace still walks back through the door to set things right. It's a truth too many in the Black community know well, that justice often comes late, and when it does, it may not look like a gavel or a headline. Sometimes it's just an overdue thank you and the space to choose your own path forward. And it's a reminder to those outside the Black community that dignity is never theirs to grant or to take away. It's already there, if they care to see it. The lesson is simple, but it carries weight. Hold on to your dignity, and when the time comes, stand for the truth without cruelty, but without compromise. In that quiet firmness lies the power to not only claim what is right, but to rebuild something better from what was broken. Life will hand you moments when the world wants you small. Answer by standing steady. Like a lamp in the window on a winter night, a single act of decency can guide us through our darkest stretches, showing that compassion is not weakness, but the strongest thing we have to offer. So maybe tonight, after the dishes are done and the house falls quiet, you'll think about the people who keep your life from coming undone, the ones in the background, steady as breath. Maybe you'll see them a little more clearly, thank them a little more sincerely. Because stories like this aren't just about two people in one house. They're about all of us, about the kind of home we make in our actions toward each other. If this story has touched something in you, let it be the start of a conversation, not the end of one. Share it forward, not for the sake of the telling alone, but to pass a little warmth into hands that might be cold right now. Sometimes that's all it takes for the world to feel like home again.